Hello everyone and welcome to Woopercast. This is episode 15 for the 18th of August 2016. As always, I'm your host, Joe Yates. So, we've got the World Championships coming up exactly tomorrow after you listen to this, so that's pretty exciting. But of course, looking further into the future, we have a whole new season to contend with a whole new rotation. And what I want to do here is kind of discuss a lot of the hype that's been going around for some of the decks going into the new format. I think we've talked about Worlds quite a bit, and I kind of want to move on and see what's going to be past that. And have a look and see what the next season is going to be like. So of course it's going to be Primal Clash on, and we've seen a lot of hype for a few decks so far. Already people are talking about what they think is going to be the top play for the format and what they think is going to dominate it in the early stages of the season. So I kind of wanted to not necessarily debunk a lot of that, but I think there's a lot of theory mon going around as opposed to actual concrete results from testing. I don't think people are putting in the hours before they put in the talk, and I think that's kind of something that I want to, a point I want to make at this podcast is that this is a brand new format. Like, this is something we've never played before. We've no big results to go off of, and it's going to be not till the Arena Cups in Germany come around, which is where the big decks start to come about. That was where Totina first became a thing. I believe Esquin Flareon even first became a thing at one of those, if I recall correctly. That could be wrong, but so that's really what I want to talk about. That's really what I want to get down to, is that you need to put in the testing before you start saying that such and such a thing is going to be good just because it looks like that on paper. There are lots of factors that you have to think about that you don't necessarily take into account when you're just kind of working off in your head. And it's cool. You have to be thinking about the game. It's a crucial part of the game is to be constantly thinking about it so that you can constantly be coming up with new ideas. But you still got to prove and disprove them. So that's kind of what I want to go through is my current testing with post-rotation. Seeing what I've kind of come to my conclusions is not, I don't want to necessarily say what like the best deck is or what deck you should be playing, because that's not where the angle I want to take. And obviously it's still too early to be saying things like that. But what I really want to say is maybe the attitude that I think that a lot of players should adapt going into the format, and some of the things that it's nice to know going into a brand new format. So anyway, yeah. First thing I want to talk about, the first deck that has been generating the most hype, and of course I'm sure you've all heard this on some corner of the internet, is Mega Rayquaza. Everyone's been going nuts over this one, saying that Joltik, Pumpkaboo, the Night March deck has just completely gone out of the format now, the one thing that was holding Rayquaza back, so obviously it's going to become a huge threat. And I wouldn't say that it is going to become a huge threat, not from what I've seen so far anyway, or from what I've played around with. It's definitely not the best deck that I've worked with so far. The main reason for this is that Mega Rayquaza is a very powerful deck. Let's not lie about this. It can hit a huge amount of damage very quickly right off the bat. And that's in a way that no other deck really can. At least not in this format, especially with Night March gone. And when we're looking at all the other decks, which are big EX decks, big Mega decks, things that Rayquaza really loves to go up against, it does seem like, yes, it's going to be quite a good pick. But actually, it doesn't really work out that way. The reason for this is that, as hyped and all as it is, everyone's going to know about it, and everyone's going to counter for it. And how easy is it to counter for Rayquaza? Well, the first thing that I think a lot of people are going to be looking at is Zipstrika. This is a non-EX attacker, double colorless energy, hits 110, plus weakness is 220, even if there's an Altaria or a weakness policy for some reason in play, or an Assault Vester. It hits through all effects, so it can hit through those. And that's pretty cool. Yes, it can one-hit KO Rayquaza. It's splashable into pretty much any deck. I think Rayquaza can sort of play around this to a certain extent by running a high count with the Dragon Rays, as opposed to the colorless base Rays. So there is a way around it, but that's not even the main problem for Rayquaza. I think the big one is Parallel City. I think if you get Parallel City, your Skyfield goes away. Okay, cool. So you go down from 8 Pokemon down to 3 Pokemon. Getting those Pokemon back is very difficult. Like, look at the format and the cards we have for Pokemon Recovery. Sacred Ash is gone. We can't use that anymore, which really sucks. You have to put in your own Skyfield again, and then you have to sort of like super odd back in 3 things. But that's only 3 out of the 5 that you would have discarded. And then you have to draw into all of them again, which means you have to find Hoopa. If your opponent's got a Garbodor in play, that's now completely off the table. You need to, without Karen as well, which is a card we thought would come in this set and then never did. So there's no real way for Rayquaza to shovel all those Pokemon back in. And on top of that, it has to even find the Sky Field, another one, before it actually finds those Pokemon again. Which means it's actually quite easy to stop it from chaining its stuff. And there's no real way that Rayquaza can actually definitely deal with this. Your best bet is like maybe Ninetales to lock your Sky Field into play, but then we've seen a lot of hype go for Garbodor, and obviously that just kind of ruins the whole Ninetales thing. Or even worse, your opponent could play Hex Maniac in basically any deck and then just shut off the Ninetales counter with the Parallel City and you're done for. And it's very hard for Rayquaza to kind of come back from that position. And of course, like, you're going down from 240 damage all the way back down to like 90 damage with the Parallel City in. So no, I think that's kind of a huge issue for Ray. So far I haven't found a good way myself to sort of play around the parallels. The Ninetales hasn't worked super well, and really there's a lot of partners you can play with Ray. And Ninetales doesn't even fit in the list once you try and put in the other partners. So is it even worth it? It's hard to say. But that's my thoughts on Ray. I don't think it's as good as people are giving it credit for. I don't think it's as hyped as it should. I think it's too hyped is what I mean. Yeah. Onto the primals, like just primal Groudon's really the only one I want to talk about here. I've seen a few people hyping this one up. I quite like it, actually. It's the funny thing about Groudon is that it is an inherently slow card in a very fast format, but it doesn't really lose any of its kind of assets that it would work with otherwise, like Wobbuffet. Of course, got the Generations reprint, meaning that we can still play it with Groudon. We can still build up a chunky Groudon on the bench. Waylord Groudon was a thing for a little bit, and with less people being turned on to playing Vespiquen, that could also be kind of a cool idea. That's still a thing. The other thing Groudon gets is that it's a Mega that doesn't really need a tool, so Klefki actually shows up, which is pretty sweet for it. You can slap on Klefki, knock out a Mega Rayquaza or something, and then next turn you just sort of don't die and you keep going. With no tool discardal, okay, it loses Focus Sash and Hard Charm, but you can replace these with Assault Vest. There's Klefki, like I just said. There's plenty of other things that you can kind of work on to the Groudon instead. I don't think it's the end of the world at all. I think this is an interesting one, and one that I definitely want to test out more. Because there's no other deck that you can kind of compare it to, especially in this format. There's nothing really... And because it's been kind of so under the radar for such a long time, in regular standard as well, that maybe this is the time for kind of making a comeback into the forefront. I can't really see anything off the bat that it would just outright lose to. So maybe Giratina could be a little bit of an issue with that ability, but you can definitely play around it with Hex Maniacs if you really wanted to. So yeah, I think it's a cool card, and I think it's something that a lot of people should be trying out, at least. So on to Mega Mewtwo is another one that's had quite a lot of hype around it. There's two main variants of Mega Mewtwo, and I think the one that's getting a lot of hype, first of all, is Damage Swap, and this is largely for the same reason the Mega Rayquaza got hype, was because Night March is gone. That was really the one thing that Mega Mewtwo actually lost to, and with that gone, in theory, it should just dominate the format, but again, it doesn't really work out like that, I don't think. You have to consider all the other new threats that appear to it as well, and even Mega Rayquaza itself can one-hit KO this thing, so you would need a variant built to deal with Mega Rayquaza. And you can't really run Parallel City in it because you need your Shrine of Memories in play, which kind of creates this awkward thing where you need some other way of dealing with the Rayquaza, and you could run it with Zep Striker, but that's way too specific just to be dealing with one matchup. Damage Swap is still a very powerful attack though, and if you can't knock out Mega Mewtwo in one hit, then, well, good luck ever winning that game, because Damage Swap is just going to wreck you. I think the Psychic weakness still hurts it. There are still some solid Psychic type Pokemon like Mega Gardevoir EX. That's something I really like going into this format. Something that can just hit it, kill it in one hit, which is obviously horrible for Mega Mewtwo. That's just what you don't want to see. It doesn't really lose anything from the rotation is another point, which is kind of cool. I mean, there aren't a whole load of archetypes that you can say the same thing about, but I think the biggest issue for it is if Mega Rayquaza does get hype, and if people are testing this thing against Mega Rayquaza, they will be put off by it, largely because of that whole Shrine of Memories Parallel City thing doesn't really work. There's also another variant of Mega Mewtwo where you can just go full offense onto the Psychic Infinity attack. This is initially how people built Mega Mewtwo. When it first came out, this is where everyone initially went to and thought, alright, well this seems like a good idea for it. And this was just kind of stacking it up with double colorless energies, Mega Turbos, getting a whole lot of energy on one Mewtwo and going from there. And just doing a ridiculous amount of damage to take one-hit KOs. I think the big question here that you want to ask yourself is what partner do you want for it? Because obviously you can't just run, well you can, but you probably shouldn't just run straight Mega Mewtwo for offense. There's a couple of different choices. Obviously it is a colorless attack cost, so you can use whatever you want really. The two that I think are probably going to be the most popular, and the two that make the most sense to me at least, the first one's Garbodor. So obviously we know how, I'll talk about Garbodor a little bit later, but obviously everyone thinks it's going to be great, and it probably is, because there's no tool discardal in the format, which means it's very hard to stop the Garbodor lock once it goes up, and that can kind of swing some auto losses or swing some bad matchups into good matchups for you. That's something that you really want to sort of work out depending on the decks that you expect to face, which is super hard going to a new format, which makes Garbodor kind of a hard call to make in the first place. But I'll get on to Garbodor a little bit later in this episode. The second one is the one that I kind of like the most, the one that I've played with quite a bit now, is Zoroark Break. So the very first Mega Mewtwo variants that we had were Mega Mewtwo with Zoroark, and this was cool. In theory, the reason it worked was that Zoroark kind of had an answer to the decks that Mega Mewtwo lost to. So think about Giratina EX. Has that ability so Megas can't touch it. You're locking off special energy, you're locking off Spirit Links. Zoroark Break is very good against Giratina EX. So there you go. Think about Rayquaza. Like I was just saying, does a lot of damage to Mega Mewtwo, can knock it out in one hit. If you have a Zoroark on the bench, you're ready to punish that. So you can actually have quite a good time against it. I ran a pretty thick Zoroark Break line. I think it was like 332 when I was testing this thing out so far. I quite like it. I think there aren't a whole load of great non-EX attackers, and the fact that this kind of deck has the flexibility to run both is really nice. I think I actually quite like this one a lot. I don't think, I'm still struggling to see if it'll be top tier or not. I mean, obviously that's a really big statement to make anyway this early on. I kind of prefer it to the damage swap variant because I think it's got a lot more flexibility. And if you do want to run it with something other than Zoroark Break, you can. If you do think of something even cleverer than that, obviously, go for it. But that's what I'm kind of settled with at the moment on Mega Mewtwo. Another big deck that I've seen a few people get hyped for is Mega Sceptile. I quite like, again, this is still kind of the same logic. And really does just show how dominant Night March has been this season, that we look at decks and say, oh, that thing's biggest loss was Night March. Night March isn't around anymore. Maybe this thing will be good now. And Mega Sceptile just falls straight into that category again. There's no a huge amount of fire decks either running around because Blacksmith's lost, so I think a lot of people will be put off playing fire, which is another reason that Mega Sceptile comes in. And again, we're kind of working on the same logic as Mega Mewtwo. They're very similar decks, really, in that you don't want to get one-hit KO. You want to sort of chain this healing process going on while taking consistent, like, 2 shots on everything else. I think Mega Sceptile kind of achieves this a bit better than Damage Swap Mewtwo, at least in my opinion, at least in my testing so far. And much like Mega Mewtwo, a big problem for it, very initially, is Rayquaza. Now, unlike Mega Mewtwo, you can kind of play Parallel City with this deck, but do bear in mind that that will actually limit your own damage. You'll be doing 80 per turn as opposed to 100. Now, if you have Ariados in play, how does this work out? You do 80, 90, 160, 170. You still, like, 3-shot it, I think, which isn't that great. You'd have to counter your own Parallel City the second time with, like, a Forest of Giant Plants or a Silent Lab or whatever kind of weird stadium you happen to be running in that list. But, like, it's more doable than the Mega Mewtwo variant against Mega Rayquaza. But I still don't quite like the matchup a lot. I think that if you are playing Mega Sceptile in the new format, the list that you would be playing will be kind of weird. Like, there will be some weird stuff. I don't think it's just a straight, consistent list of Mega Sceptile is actually going to have the best around-the-board matchups. I think you might have to... I mean, you do have the scope to play weird techs with it, like in the same way that Mega Manectric did, and I think that's going to be some kind of creative build like that. Is the direction that Sceptile is going to have to go if it wants to thrive in the new format, which I think it could, because a lot of decks are going to struggle to knock it out in one hit, and that's going to be an issue. And even with things like Klefki going around, you've still got that healing. So, like, the healing effect still works. So that even if you are only taking, like, 2 shots on it, it doesn't really matter because, well, taking a 2-shot on a Sceptile is pretty difficult to do. You have to wait for it to run out of, like, Fisherman's and energy retrievals. And any good Sceptile list won't be doing that anytime soon. So, I quite like it. But I think it's going to need a lot of practice and a lot of work before it's ready. I don't think it's the kind of thing that you're just going to be able to snap straight to. So, what is up next on my list? Yeah, okay, so that really covers all the megas. That actually is all of the megas that I wanted to talk about. And it is worth noting that there are a lot more megas there than we have seen like this season. It begs a few questions. Cards that specifically target megas, are they good or are they bad? So, there's 3 main ones. Klefki. I like Klefki. You all know I like Klefki. If you watched any of the other shows, you know I like Klefki. This is a really cool card. Pick up a playset of them. They're very, very nice. It's just something I'm playing around with quite a lot in a few different lists, and I really enjoy it quite a bit. So I'm a big fan of Klefki. Mega Catcher. I know people want this to be good. I want this to be good. It's a cool card, and it looks great, and if you pull it off, it'll be the most mind-blowing thing of the whole game, but I don't think it's going to be good. Look, it's really specific. It's an extremely specific card, and 90% of the time Lizond is going to do the same thing anyway, so it's really hard to recommend this one. The other thing about it is that it targets your opponent's megas, but how often does your opponent have a mega on the bench that you want to kill, as opposed to a mega in the active spot already? Like, if they've got a mega, it's because they want to attack with it, right? There is no, like, support mega, like Mega Audino would be in the VGC. So I don't see why your opponent would have a mega on the bench with energy that you want to kill unless they've like retreated to save it for a turn, but how often does that even come up? Even in the matchups where it's relevant, I still think Mega Catcher is too specific to actually run, but if you do pull it off, you're a legend. The other one then is Faded Town, which is quite a nifty one. There are a couple of decks that can probably take advantage of Faded Town. Darkrai Giratina is something I'll get onto a little later, which I do quite like, and that can probably have the scope to run Faded Town. Even in things like the Vespiquen deck, which I profiled a couple of weeks ago on the channel, that can afford to run Faded Town too. So, I don't know where you find the room, but you can if you want to, is the point I'm trying to make. So, it's a nice card, I quite like it, and we haven't seen it in the format for a while because it just hasn't been relevant enough. Maybe now it is. I did actually play it like all the way back in November in London Regionals. It could have been a paint roller on the day, but that's a whole different story. So yeah. The other one's Umbreon EX. Man, 70 damage isn't a lot. But if you're running a dark deck and if you've got Ninja Boy in it, man, go for it. Look, Umbreon's the one that I can't see working, but that I still want to try. Because the idea of being able to take 4 prizes on a single knockout, and with support like Ninja Boy, and with Dark still being good, it makes a lot of sense. So I'm willing to give it a shot, but I can't see it being super successful. Anyway, so onto Darkrai Giratina. This is a really good one actually, because I don't think it loses anything moving from old format to new format. Pretty much nothing that I can come up with off the top of my head anyway. You can still run Latios EX. With Ninja Boy it becomes a lot easier. Of course, there's barely anything to donk anymore, but you know, the option exists. It doesn't really lose anything, so that's pretty cool. Giratina, despite what I think a lot of people are claiming, it doesn't die with the release of Pokemon Ranger. The reason for this is because it does have that ability that prevents Megas from actually doing any damage to it, which a lot of people forget about because the rest of Giratina is so good. But it does have that ability, and if your opponent plays Ranger and then tries to attack you with your Mega Rayquaza, like, oh, I can't. I should have hexed instead. So it kind of puts your opponent in a really awkward position. I quite like it. I think Giratina's still got a lot to offer, especially against Mega Rayquaza. It's an inherently good card against Mega Rayquaza. It's got a great attack and ability to deal with it. And a lot of HP, which Mega Rayquaza doesn't like to see. Well, it does like to see, but it's yeah, you know what I mean. It's more difficult for it to deal with. Like with the Fury Belt, you still force Mega Rayquaza to commit quite a lot on their bench. The biggest question, I think, with Darkrai Giratina is what kind of variant do you run? Do you just run a Darkrai... Do you run Darkrai with the Giratina? Do you run Darkrai without the Giratina? Do you run it with Garbodor? Do you run it without Garbodor? There's a whole lot of variance here and a lot of unpredictability, but I think they're all quite good options. I don't think there's any one right answer to that question. So far, actually, the variants without Giratina seem to be doing better than I expected. Like, the Giratina isn't necessarily needed in a whole lot of matchups. I think it definitely gives you a better time against Rayquaza, though. But you could still have answers to that if you ran Parallel Cities and Garbodor, like I said. So it's interesting to note that you don't necessarily need the Giratina, but it does create an unholy amount of damage, especially in a format where Zoroark is gone, and where people really have to run Enhanced Armor if they want to deal with it, but finding the room for that's difficult in the first place. I personally like just the format with Darkrai, Tina, and Garbodor, and it doesn't even necessarily depend on what your matchups are or what decks you want to be countering for, because if you're running it without Tina, like I said, you can just run Parallel City and you sort of still get the effect of a good Ray matchup. So really, I think my recommendation would be throw them all in. You're not really going to lose anything, just know when to play certain cards, when not to play certain cards. Yeah, I think it's a cool deck. I think it's actually going to be one of the best decks going into the new format. It's one of the strongest ones that we've tested so far, and one of the strongest ones that we found. One of the most difficult ones to beat, necessarily, as well, because it's unpredictable, and even if your opponent does flip over a Darkrai, you don't know what the rest of their deck is going to be straight off the bat. It's more unpredictable than a lot of the other decks in the format, so I think that makes it quite cool. So, onto this Garbodor itself. This has been a huge talking point so far, and with good reason. Zoroark is gone, Megaphone is gone, so you put a tool on Garbodor and it's there, unless your opponent's playing Minccino, which is super awkward to do. Minccino's cool, but look, it doesn't really work 100% of the time, so it's hard to recommend. But I think my recommendation will be Garbodor would be, first of all, it's still hard to fit into decks. You still need to commit a 2-2 line plus float stones if you're not already running them. So it is still kind of a commitment for the list to make. But if you have the room and you can get away with it, I would say go for it. Even though there will be a lot of matchups where I don't think the Garbodor is super useful, I think there's been so much hype around it that no one in their right mind would play a deck super ability focused in the opening weeks of this format, because you'd have to be crazy or have just like really, really brave to do so. I mean, just with the sheer amount of going into a format knowing everyone's talking about Garbodor, I know Garbodor will beat my deck 100%, but I'm still going to play this super ability focused deck. I can't see it happening. I think the kind of deck I would be looking for would be one that didn't play Garbodor, but also wasn't beaten by Garbodor. I think that might be the best way to approach it. It's a really weird talking point because it's already become so commanding, and there are so many decks that you can say, oh, right, well, that loses to Garbodor, and there's literally nothing you can do about it, like Greninja. But, again, I still think there are lists that can afford to play it, and I still think people will play it going forward, especially in the earlier parts of next season. The other really cool thing is if you're worried about Vileplume, you can play Klefki and Garbodor, and then attach the Klefki to the Garbodor, and hey, now you're free of items, because a Klefki is a tool that you can play under item lock. So there's another reason why Klefki is cool. Speaking about Vileplume, how about Vileplume? It's still cool. I mean, think about it, right? We have so much item lock in this format already. Going into Worlds, of course, we have Trevenant, we have Seismitoad, and we have Vespiquen and Vileplume. Plenty of item lock decks going around, making it very hard to play decks. And all of them are equally popular is what I mean. But going into this format, Trevenant's gone, Toad's gone, the only item lock we have is Vileplume, and technically Hoot Hoot, but obviously no one will play that. And I think this inherently makes it, we have to look at it. We've already seen how powerful item lock can be. We've already seen how dominating it can be in the format. We have to look at it and say, okay, what kind of decks can we put this in? What kind of decks can we build around it? As much as I want Vespiquen and Vileplume to still be good, I don't think it's necessarily initially the way I would go with Vileplume. especially because that deck does deal better with non-EX decks than EX decks, and we are seeing quite a lot of EXs on this list of decks that are probably going to be good. So, being the only item lock left means it's inherently powerful. It means it's something we have to look at. What do you play with it then, if you're not playing Vespiquen? You've got plenty of options. Really, you can play this with just about anything you want, as definitely showcased by Zygarde Vileplume, which just whatever that deck was. So initially, I think people will be looking at some kind of like, you could play it with like Mew and a toolbox sort of list, like Glaceon, Regice, Jolteon, other lock cards. Vileplume Regice was a deck when Vileplume initially came out. Something I played around with quite a lot. I quite like it. And since then, you've got things like Manaphy EX to help with the free retreat. The big issue for Vileplume, of course, is that AZ left, but I don't think it's impossible to work around it. We still have Floatstone, we still have Manaphy. If you want to run Water Energy, you can just attach that, and you got free retreat on your Vileplume now instantly, which is really cool. We also have a little card called Olympia, which I have mentioned on the show more times than I hope any other Pokemon podcast has ever mentioned Olympia, because it's a cool card. This thing is a switching card that's a supporter, but you heal 30 damage. Like, it looks terrible. But there are these weird uses for her, like this. You can switch out from Vileplume from the active into the bench, and hey, you keep your Vileplume. So even if you don't have a Floatstone on it, or even if you don't have another Forest of Giant Plants in play, Vileplume's still good. You can still go straight back to the bench and keep attacking. And realistically, your opponent's only going to get one Lazant per game because they're item locked. So you only really need to play one Olympia per game, which means you only need like a 2 count of it. So you still definitely got options there. I think Vileplume's still good. I think you play it with things like Tina as well. Again, that kind of plays in with the whole Manaphy thing with like double Dragon Energies and Water Energies if you want to go that route. There's plenty of options to play with Vileplume. You could still play Zygarde Vileplume. That doesn't really lose anything either. Yeah, weird decks. And I think this thing's still going to be good. It really doesn't lose anything other than AZ, which has plenty of ways to work around that. It's still going to be good, guys. I would say look at Vileplume, definitely. So we're kind of onto the non-EX decks now, of which there aren't very many. Yeah, it's a definite shift from last format when we had Night March dominating everywhere, forcing other people to play non-EX decks just because they could prize trade well with Night March. And now we have like barely any really viable non-EXs, or at least definitely not as many as there were last format. First one's Greninja Break. This is a really interesting talking point because here's the thing. If nobody plays Garbodor, Greninja is really, really good. Like, I mean, look at all the decks that I've mentioned here. Aside from, like, Sceptile, Greninja can kind of handle its own against all these things. But Garbodor. And this is a huge talking point for it. I think initially in the early weeks of this format, we're not going to see anyone play Greninja. I would be very, very surprised if anyone did. But it's just funny that, because eventually Garbodor could just drop off. Like, if you think about it, there's going to be if we assume that there's going to be a lot of Garbodor, nobody's going to play decks that need abilities. And if nobody's playing decks that need abilities, nobody's going to need to play Garbodor to counter them. So Garbodor will drop off, and then there's like this space where Greninja can kind of come in. And maybe by then we'll actually get some consistent tool removal, like maybe a Megaphone or a Xerosig reprint or something along those lines that can then push Greninja back into the competitive scene. For now, I think it has to kind of wait for a little bit before the Garbodor hype dies down. Again, if it's in the initial weeks, I will be immensely surprised. Yes, you can play like you can just replace all of the promo Jirachis with Minchinos. Oh dear God, I cannot see that one working at all. But look, give it a shot. I think it's still something you want to keep your Greninjas for. I would not write it off right off the bat. It's still going to be a good deck, just not initially. Raichu is something a lot of people have been hyping up. The interesting thing about Raichu is that, okay, look, it's a lightning type. Cool, it beats Mega Rayquaza. And yeah, that sounds great. I think it gets hurt by a lot of the same things Rayquaza does. If this thing got Karen, if Karen ever comes out, this is where things like Raichu and Rayquaza will start becoming really good again. But initially, no, because in the same way, if you get knocked, you lose your stadium, you lose all your Pokemon, you're doing 60 damage with a parallel in play, and you're kind of screwed up. You can also, like, you lose Muscle Band and you lose the Bats. Well, you lose Crobat. So adding to that damage for one hit KOs is less viable. Really, the best tool that you could use for this thing is actually Bursting Balloon, which is kind of a cool card now that all the tool removal is gone. It means that it's another way of Raichu getting damage counters onto things. And I have actually considered trying to play Mega Tyranitar with Bursting Balloon just to see if I can like find some way of making that thing work. But no, initially, like, I think it's a cool idea, and I think the toolbox style lends itself well. I think the Vespiquen deck that I profiled earlier is kind of more suited to this, especially in a form once Karen comes in, you just stop playing Vespiquen and start playing Raichu. That's how I'm planning to work with it. But I think if you want kind of a toolbox deck, that Vespiquen list is a lot better than I think Raichu could be, because Raichu is so much more easily countered. But yeah, it kind of sucks for now. As a splashable kind of card in other decks, yeah, I could see that. I could see it as a cool little non-EX attacker to finish things off. But as its own deck, man, that'll be a hard list to build, a really hard one to build. You could play it with like Regirocks or something. I don't know. I was thinking like Regirock Mew to copy the Regirock so you beat Mega Mewtwo then, and then you've got Regirock to beat Darkrai, and then you've got like Ranger to keep attaching around Giratina. Very difficult to build, but if you can come up with something, get the creative juices flowing, something you probably want to build as a group project. That's how we've been working it, at least anyway. That's something to think about, at least. Final one's going to be Straight Zoroark. In theory, I do like this because of all the hype Mega Rayquaza has been getting. But I think if Straight Zoroark is going to continue to work, it's going to need a huge amount of changes. It lost two really crucial cards in Muscle Band and Target Whistle. These are, anyone who plays Straight Zoroark knows how important these cards are. Even losing Druddigan sucks a lot. That card was cool. It needs to add to its damage. It is not doing enough damage without those modifiers. The Target Whistle, even as a 1 or 2 off, was really nice, and you can't really replace it with Pokepuff because it's just so much more inconsistent. No one's really going to let you play a Pokepuff. It's so easy to play around. Yeah, I think drastic changes need to come to this list if it is going to be good. I think if Mega Rayquaza is for some reason seeing an awful lot of play, then yes, this is where this comes in. But other than that, I think it's something you need to put on the back burner just for now. So yeah, I think that's all the decks I wanted to talk about. That's everything I wanted to cover in this video. Thank you so much for watching. We will be back every Thursday, 5 PM British Standard Time. Same place, same time. You can find us on Facebook, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, wherever. All the links will be in the description for all of that stuff. Good luck if you're going to the World Championships this weekend. You're probably not listening to this. I hope you're practicing instead. But yeah, definitely have a good time there. I'll probably be doing a recap episode of that too next week. And yeah, so thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.